Now I would like to move forward with today's presentation, and I'm going to introduce Edward Poznanski to you. Edward graduated from the Carleton University with an honors Bachelor of Arts degree with specialization in history and political science, followed by a Master of Arts degree with specialization in public administration. He also served, of course, the most important thing, he served 9 years with the Royal Canadian Artillery and has had a career with the Public Service of Canada for over 36 years. It's with my great pleasure that I introduce to you this afternoon, Edward Poznanski.
Thank you very much, Louise. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Dzień dobry państwu. It's really great to be here today with you people, and I want to thank the friends for inviting me and doing the whole setup here. This is a wonderful facility to host such an event. I wouldn't describe the presentation we're about to have today as a lecture. Rather, what I would term it as is a sort of a walk through who's who of Canadians and Poles who helped forge a relationship that goes back now well over a century in wartime. And some of the people that I will cover are people you've heard of, and other ones are probably completely unknown to you. On some of the subjects, I will do a deeper dive, but this is going to be a pretty fast overview. Now, I want to be honest with you as well. When studying either World War I or World War II, the Canadian-Polish relationship often doesn't come to mind. Indeed, when looking at the relationships that Canadians had, it was often with the people who hosted them, such as the British, or the people they liberated, such as the French, the Belgians, the Dutch, the Italians. Canadians did not march down the streets of Polish cities in liberation to cheering crowds. Ironically, however, Polish soldiers marched down Canadian streets. But Canada did play an important role in supporting a free and independent Poland in both wars. And of course, Canada became home to many Polish veterans and refugees after the Second World War. Now, I don't have any opening jokes for you. I just need to get to the material, but I will ask in the crowd, in the audience, are there any World War I buffs? Just applause if you're a World War I buff. Well, you're in luck, because the first 2 hours is going to be about World War I. Then we'll have an intermission, and we go on to World War II. But this is an important year of anniversary, so I think it's very appropriate that we talk about this subject today. So 100 years ago, in 1919, the Polish Army training camp at Niagara-on-the-Lake was closed. Remember, World War I didn't officially end until the Treaty of Versailles in the summer of 1919. 80 years ago, two Polish liners were transformed into convoy ships and helped transport the Canadian 1st Division to Europe in 1939. 75 years ago, Poles and Canadians were together at some of the most momentous battles of the war: Monte Cassino, D-Day, Falaise, Warsaw, and Arnhem. Now, let's situate what the situation was of Canada and Poland and do a little bit of comparison. So I'm not going back to the book of Genesis, but I'm going to go to the beginning of the 18th century, because this was a transformational century in the development of both Canada and Poland. Now, as we can see on the left, in Canada, the partition of unceded Aboriginal lands was well underway. So in North America, principally France and Britain had dividing up the continent. We even see Spain down near the bottom. In Poland, at the beginning of the 18th century, was still a pretty substantial Eastern European multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious land power. At one time, it has stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It sort of shrunk a little bit, but this was at the end of the Austro-Turkish Wars. and where the Poles had played a huge role in breaking the Turkish siege of Vienna. And we'll see how thankful the Austrians were later. So if we fast forward now about 75 years, we see that Canada, well, not yet Canada, was now completely under the British. The French had been knocked out of North America after the 7 Years' War. This is just before the American Revolution, so the British are at the height of their power in North America. But in Poland, the first of 3 partitions was taking place. So compared to the previous slide, Russia has now taken a piece, Austria and Prussia. Now we go to 1791, and North America's changed a bit, so they've now had the independence of the United States after the American Revolution. United Empire Loyalists had come to Canada, which caused a partition of sorts, that the former province of Quebec was now divided into a Lower Canada and an Upper Canada. But in Poland, there was now a second partition where Poland shrunk even further after being partitioned between Prussia and Russia. And then just a few years later, nothing really much had changed in North America, but now Poland was completely gone in a third and final 18th century partition that saw Prussia, Austria, and Russia divvy it up. And Poland would be gone for the next 123 years, but the flame of Polish patriotism and the dreams of Polish independence was kept alive in the Polish people, whether they stayed on the land, whether they went into exile, or whether they immigrated. So now this brings us to the First World War. Now what's curious about these 2 flags is that neither one of them was official. Canada's flag in the First World War was the Union Jack, and Poland wasn't even a country, but this is one of the sort of symbolic Polish flags. And when the war broke out, of course, Canada did not declare war. As a colony, Canada was automatically at war when Britain declared war. And in Poland, well, again, being divided up between the 3 empires, every Pole knew that if Poland was going to have a chance for independence after this war, the impossible would need to happen. And that would be the collapse, the simultaneous collapse of Germany, Austria, and Russia. Now, the wartime experiences for Canadian Poles would be vastly different, but we'll see that nevertheless, many Canadians became involved in the Polish cause for freedom during the war. Again, just a quick refresh. So Canada in 1914 was now post-Confederation. Canada was coast to coast to coast. And in Poland, obviously still divvied up. The big change since our last map is that the border that ran through Poland between Prussia and Russia had been adjusted after the Napoleonic Wars, and it was no longer a Prussian-Russian border, it was a German-Russian border. And many of the Eastern Front battles took place in what is Polish land, and whereas Canada was fighting its war abroad, Poland became a battlefield. And Polish homes, villages, farms, towns, properties, communities were destroyed. There were a million refugees. And many of the destructive battles on the Eastern Front, such as Krasnik, Przemysl, Warsaw, Łódź, Limanowa, Bolimów, which, by the way, was the first use of gas in the First World War, not heat, and Gorlice Tarnów, all took place in Polish soil, and they are, even to the World War I buffs in this room, I would suggest that these may not be well known to you. And that's understandable because as Canadians, we have a Western Front-centric view of the world, of the World War. And even though Poland didn't have a national army of its own, Poles were taking part in combat in the First World War on both sides of the Eastern Front. 3 Polish brigades were part of the Austrian armed forces, and there was a Polish legion with the Russian armed forces. Now, again, it's my pitch to the World War I buffs in the room. I've just sort of said how the war was so different for Canada and Poland. Was it possible to have a common battlefield? Does anybody recognize this monument? I'm counting on the World War I buffs here.
Give us a hint.
Okay, kind of as I thought. All right. Anybody recognize this monument? All right. And can you believe that's the common Canadian-Polish battlefield of World War I? Now, these two monuments are 3.2 kilometers apart. Now, the truth of the matter is that Poles and Canadians were not at Vimy Ridge at the same time. A Polish company in the French Foreign Legion took Vimy Ridge on May the 9th, 1915. They were part of a French Foreign Legion regiment, 2e Régiment de Marche du 1er Régiment Étranger, which was part of La Division Marocaine. And although they managed to take the ridge, there were insufficient reinforcements, and there were fierce German counterattacks, and the Polish company was virtually decimated. This company, Polish company, was formed in early 1914. The French had a policy of not allowing national units in the French Foreign Legion, but given France's desperation, an exception was made. And it was in May 1915 that this company went into the offensive for the first time. 50 Polish survivors came off of Vimy Ridge, and in the next month, the company was virtually destroyed at the Battle of Souchez. This is important because this was a Polish presence on the Western Front. And for Poles that dreamed of Poland being able to participate on the Allied side on the Western Front, this was the hope, but it was dashed. And we'll see how that dream was not abandoned, and that there would be eventually another Polish force on the Western Front. So these are now the attempts to raise a Polish army in the West during the First World War. And I try to give these my own names, so you'll see there are many attempts to do this. So the first one was through a Polish-American committee called Polski Centralny Komitet Ratunkowy, Polish Central Relief Commission. And from very early on in the war, Polish groups in the United States, and here we have to remember there were about maybe 35,000 Polish Canadians in Canada at the outbreak of the war. There were like 3 million Polish Americans. And from the earliest days of the war, Polish American groups were contacting the British Embassy in Washington and Canadian immigration officials in New England to say that we've got thousands of volunteers who want to join the war, they want to join the Canadian forces. Of course, as we know, the United States was neutral at the beginning of the war. And the correspondence shows that this idea of getting Polish recruits to come to Canada, form a Polish legion within the Canadian military, was important enough that it got the attention of senior politicians like Sir Sam Hughes, the Minister of Militia and Defense, Sir Douglas Hazen, who is the Minister of Marine and Fisheries, and of course even the Prime Minister. And at the senior bureaucrat level, there was the Deputy Minister of Militia and Defense, Eugène Fisset, the Chief of Canadian General Staff, Sir Willoughby Wotton, will be coming back to him more than once, Sir Joseph Pope, who was the Undersecretary of State for External Affairs, Rodolphe Boudreau, who was the Clerk of the Privy Council, and William Duncan Scott, who was the Deputy Minister, or the Superintendent rather, of Immigration. Now, as the Canadians were figuring out what to do with this spirit of volunteerism among Polish Americans, some of the first questions they began to address was, how do we finance this? And then those questions began to morph into, well, what do we do if these volunteers are naturalized American citizens? We may have some citizenship issues to deal with, and not to mention diplomatic complications with the United States. Canada consulted Britain, and the British basically said, well, leave it up to Canadian discretion what you want to do, but then eventually some regulations were discovered that basically prohibited the enlistment of foreigners and the formation of any separate units of foreigners. So by about October 1914, as far as the Canadian government was concerned, the idea wasn't going to fly. Plus, Canada was having its own challenges just trying to organize the Canadian Expeditionary Force at that time. Now, it's all about timing, because in the United States, this committee that I referred to was formed in October 1914, and it became an umbrella organization for several Polish-American organizations. including the Polish Falklands Alliance that we'll come to in a few moments. So this committee was formed, and 3 representatives came to Canada to discuss with the Canadian government this idea of how you could recruit Polish Americans. Now, unfortunately, their visit happened in November, and Canadian government already decided in October this wasn't going to happen. But they came anyway, and Antoni Karabasz was a Polish immigrant in the United States. He became a successful pharmacist. He was the vice president of this committee. Jan Franciszek Smulski was also another Polish immigrant in the United States. He was a successful banker in Chicago. And Dr. Teofil Stajiński, he also was a Polish immigrant. He became a doctor, and he was the president of the Falklands Alliance. And they came to Canada prepared to offer 7,000 volunteers. Unfortunately, it fell onto deaf ears. So that was the end of that initiative. But they didn't give up. So the Polish Falklands Alliance that I mentioned before was a patriotic physical fitness organization, and its dream was the regeneration of the Polish nation. It had been founded in the United States in 1887, and as the 20th century dawned, it took on more of a paramilitary character and introduced military training to its members as well as physical fitness. So in 1915, the gentleman on the left, Andrzej Malkowski, he was a veteran of the Polish legions in the Eastern Front, and he made it to the United States in 1915, and his personal mission was to recruit a Polish force from the United States, and he believed that the Falcons would be the prime recruiting ground. He was soon found himself as the head scoutmaster for the Falcons, and he believed that to get this legion, he could do it with the cooperation of Canada and Great Britain. Now, he was acting a bit rogue because this Polish Relief Committee was not ready for anybody to take unilateral action on their own. This was an umbrella organization meant to represent all a number of Polish American organizations. But he did have a friend in the Falcons, Wincenty Skajiński, and together they decided to come to Canada and lobby for a Polish legion in Canada. And they met somebody by the name of Sir William Price, who was a Canadian industrialist. And they met him in September 1916. He was well connected to the Prime Minister. He had a huge role in the setup of Valcartier. And it makes you wonder, why did they want to see Sir William Price? Well, again, it just happened to be that, according at least to Skajiński's own testimony, he had met a friend, a Canadian friend, whose family was well connected to Canadian power players, and that's how Skajiński got introduced to Price. Price was really enthusiastic about the idea. He wanted to support the Legion. He was connected to Hughes, and anybody knows who Sam Hughes, there was no idea too small that would capture his support. And General Guatin, too, was also interested in the idea. And Price was also urging the project on Borden, who then involved the Minister of Customs, Sir John Dowsley Reed. And at this time, the discussions between Malkowski, Skajiński, and Price, they were talking about a legion of anywhere 6,000 to 25,000 men that would basically be, a Polish unit within the Canadian military. They were having regimental colors, their own insignia, but they would be definitely under the Union Jack. As they continued their plans, it must have been serious because a delegation of Canadian General Staff officers met some of the Falcon leaders in Detroit, and another Falcon, Franciszek Dziób, also joined the initiative. Now, Borden also consulted London to see if the British would be okay this time with a Polish legion as part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. And expecting a positive response, Price continued to use his friends and influence and make the rounds with various Canadian ministries. However, the plan began to unravel for 2 reasons. Number one, depending on how you look at it, Hughes either resigned or was fired from cabinet in the fall of 1916, and there was now another plan to raise the Polish Legion on the table. So now we're at our third concept, and we're having more players now. So basically, during the summer of 1916, the British War Office and Foreign Foreign Office, jointly sponsored a scheme to recruit Poles in North America for the Canadian Army, but from Britain. And the key player in this was Jan Maria Poznanski. So he was a Pole who had made it to Britain, and he was an agent for the British government. He became a trusted advisor to the British government on Polish matters, and this is why he was able to convince them, the Foreign Office and the War Office, that he could somehow pull this off, that he could get a legion in North America. And he had also met with Hughes when Hughes was in London in the summer of 1916 to share that idea with him. Now, we're not talking about 6 to 25,000 soldiers anymore. Poznanski is talking about 50 to 100,000 soldiers. And so his vision and initiative is completely separate from that of Malkowski's and Skałdziński's. So the Britain advised the Canadian Prime Minister that Poznanski was going to come to Canada and see if this could be arranged. In the meantime, Poznanski was able to pry Jub away from Malkowski and Skałdziński and get him to join his plan. And somewhere in the background, the Falcon leadership decided to support Poznanski's plan. So now with Poznanski arriving in Canada in the fall, discussions started to happen with Canadian officials. Again, General Watkin was involved. And in early December, Sir Edward Kemp, who now replaced Hughes as defense minister, reported to the Prime Minister now an arrangement had been made to start the training of Polish officers in Canada. Because with this big dream of 50 to 100,000 soldiers, the first thing he needed were officers. And so this was the agreement that was struck in December 1916. Now, what happened to the other players? Well, it turns out that Price ended up taking command of the 171st Canadian Forces Canadian Expeditionary Force Battalion, went overseas. Jub went on to become a recruiter for the Polish Army, and we'll learn a little bit more about what happened to Malkowski and Skałdziński. Now, again, completely separate from these initiatives, there was a concept to have a Polish Canadian Expeditionary Force Battalion. How many of you knew about that? Okay, that's pretty good. So, as I mentioned, there are about 35,000 people of Polish origin in Canada at the beginning of the war. This is extrapolating from the 1911 census. And the Falcons also had a branch in Winnipeg. Now, according to Winnipeg's Polish language newspaper Czas, in summer of 1916, they reported the Canadian cabinet gave authority to raise a Polish battalion as part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. And the idea was that it was going to have a Canadian commanding officer, but all the other officers would be Polish. They would superimpose Polish emblems. I think that's an attempt at a Polish eagle on top of a maple leaf. And it was nicknamed the 250th White Eagles, or Polish battalion. So things actually did get off the ground. So Lieutenant Colonel William Henry Hastings was named as the commanding officer. Apparently he was, his appointment was lobbied for by the Polish community of Winnipeg, and I should add that 2/3 of Polish Canadians at the time of the First World War lived in Manitoba. So it makes sense that this battalion was going to be formed there. And so he became the commanding officer. His son, nepotism, patronage was a big thing in the early 20th century. He became, with his father, he helped on the mobilization plans of the battalion, and he became a platoon commander. And then Captain Francis Stanislaus Szablewski, he had been born in Poland, but he was a Manitoban civil servant. He apparently is the fellow who lobbied for the creation of a Polish battalion in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and he became the battalion's quartermaster. Now, it was pretty hard for me to identify him because I was using Winnipeg newspapers to find out about the creation of the battalion, and his name was massacred. It was never spelled the same way twice in any newspaper. And when I finally got something close, I just went in the Library and Archives World War I records, and was able to find sort of the full file on him. But it didn't have a great end. Shablevsky in particular, he ended up changing his name to Frank Stanley Shablo, so I guess he gave up on the Shablevsky piece. But the battalion never reached its full strength. When it moved to Valcartier in June 1917 for training as an understrength battalion, and while it was in Valcartier, it was absorbed by the 249th Battalion from Saskatchewan, and then that battalion went overseas. So far, I've been unable to find a complete nominal role for this battalion. I found a few names on lists on Ancestry.com, and other than Shablevsky, I haven't found any other Polish-sounding names, so I don't know how successful it was in recruiting Polish Canadians. Now, as I mentioned before, there had been an agreement reached in December 1916 whereby Canada had agreed to train a cadre of Polish officers, and in early January 1917, the first group of 23 Poles from the United States came to Canada, and they came in secrecy, in fact, because there were still the issues that they were Americans coming now to Canada. They joined the School of Infantry Military District No. 2 and had their training at the University of Toronto. And this building, or this picture on the left, is actually the main entrance to the University College of Building, and that's a current photo. We'll see this later. And we'll see the officer cadre training expanded and eventually moved to Camp Borden. Now, these were the Canadians who received and trained these 23 first officer recruits and later recruits. So Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Lepin, we'll come to see him again later. He was the commandant of the school. He was a civil engineer and the superintendent of the buildings and grounds at the University of Toronto. Major Clarence Richard Young was the school adjutant, and he was an assistant professor of structural engineering at the university. Major George Neville Bramfett was a senior instructor of the school, but he had also been with the Faculty of Education, was a music instructor at the University of Toronto. Major Henry Harrison Medill, another instructor for the cadets, and he'd been a lecturer in architecture at the University of Toronto. Major William Frederick Kirk. He'd been with the Corps of School Cadet Instructors. He'd been associated with the University of Toronto Schools and been a school principal. And then finally, Captain Frank Butler Kendrick, another instructor, and he'd been an assistant professor of chemistry at the University of Toronto. So on the left, that's the same building we saw just 2 slides ago. That's the first class of Polish officers at the University of Toronto. And among them were Andrzej Malkowski and Wincenty Skarżyński. So these were the two that kind of came on their own rogue mission to get a Legion. It didn't work. Malkowski was initially so disappointed, he went off and he joined the Canadian Mounted Rifles in Windsor. But when the officer training started, he then got seconded to the school to get his officer training. And then he rejoined the Canadian Mounted Rifles, but eventually joined the Polish Army in 1918. And Wincenty Skarżyński, he decided to go through the training, he graduated, and then he became a trainer for the second cohort. Lucjan Falkowski, on the right, was a Polish American. He was in the first class, and I decided to include him because he was the first Polish American volunteer of this new Polish army who would be killed in combat. He was killed in combat on the Western Front in July 1918. Now, the program grew, and there was a second cohort that initially came to University of Toronto, and then we moved to Camp Borden, and then the third cohort came, and they started off at Camp Borden. But then a big event happened in 1917. The United States declared war and was now on the Allied side. And our friend Jan Maria Horodysky, that had planned this Polish army of 50 to 100,000 soldiers, now thought, okay, why not just do it all in the United States? We can have a Polish army within the American forces. It'll be commanded by American forces. They could train in Canada. So he kind of changed his tune And it appeared now that this Polish Legion concept was not going to be part of the Canadian military, but rather part of the American military. So discussions were undertaken, and there was some division within the United States. Some Americans thought this might be a good, American leaders thought this might be a good idea. Others were opposed to it, didn't like the idea of having national units within the American forces. But the idea must have been serious enough, because there was a Canadian delegation that did go to the United States to see if the Americans would need Canadian help on this. So the issue was certainly being discussed again by the top brass, the Chief of the General Staff, General Wartime, the Minister of Militia and Defense, Albert Edward Kemp, and the Prime Minister. And then the mission that went to the United States to meet with American officials was led by Sir Joseph Pope, who was the Undersecretary of External Affairs, and with him came Major General Sidney Chilton Newburn, who was part of the Canadian General Staff, and then also Colonel Charles Stephen McInnes, who was Deputy Adjutant General. And they went on a tour in Washington. And basically, at the end of this tour, Pope reported back to the Prime Minister to say he didn't think the Americans would need any Canadian help or any Canadian facilities to help create this legion. Then another idea popped up. So about 2 months after the United States declared war, now the French President, Raymond Poincaré, issued a decree to the surprise of everyone. That is, the Poles, the Americans, the British, the Canadians, that France would now form a Polish army on the Western Front. It would serve under the Polish flag, would be under French operational command. But they did realize that the sizable Polish-American community would be a fertile ground for recruiting. They were going to start off the army with Poles who were in the German or Austrian forces and had been taken prisoners of war, so this was going to be the starting point, but they knew that they could really tap into, or thought they could tap into, all the Polish Americans in the United States. So, of course, by the time this announcement had happened, the Americans hadn't made any progress on a Polish legion with the United States. So, was there a role for Canada now in this new scheme? Well, it turns out there was. So the French sent now a mission to Canada. It was Colonel Paul Edmond Vignal, and he was later accompanied by Colonel James Martin. And they came to see General Watton because they believed that Canada would be the best place to train this new Polish army in France, because Canada had been at war for 3 years, had a training infrastructure. The United States was busy getting itself organized. And they also wanted to see if they could open some recruiting centers for this Polish army in Canada. Eventually, they had 3, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal. And so Canada agreed that they would provide the training for the volunteers to this Polish army in France. And Colonel Lapin, who was commanding the officer school, was now ordered to pack up, leave Borden, and open up a training camp in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario. And this is where I just want to spend a minute on General Watton. So he'd been associated with this whole idea of creating a Polish army during the First World War pretty much from the get-go. He was generally supportive, but he was the figure that did the moving and the shaking to get Niagara-on-the-Lake to become the training center for this new Polish army. He arranged for the supply of uniforms, equipment, and all kinds of other supplies, and this is why he's referred very often as the grandfather of the Polish army. So the Polish army set up shop in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario. The first recruits started to arrive there in early October, and by the 8th of October, a very important event happened. The United States gave permission for the recruitment of the Polish army from among Polish Americans, and now volunteers were pouring in across the border. In the center is a very unique cap badge. That's the cap badge the Polish soldiers wore in Canada. It's the only place they wore that cap badge. They wore other insignia once they were in Europe. On the right is a painting by a Canadian war artist. Just gives you an idea of some of the uniforms that the Polish recruits wore while they were in Canada. And these are some of the key Canadian military staff. So Lapin, Young, and Medill, they had all been associated with the officer training. There were many other instructors in support and other people in support roles, Canadians, to receive the Polish Army. But I do want to say a word about Lepan because he had enormous challenges to deal with. This whole camp in Niagara-on-the-Lake had to be set up quickly, and with the volume of recruits, he had to deal with overcrowding, lack of winter quarters for 1917-18, lack of transportation to get the recruits to ports so they could get to France, lack of payments from the French government, and eventually he had to deal with the outbreak of the Spanish flu. Now, he spoke very highly of the Polish recruits, and he was decorated multiple times by the Polish government after the war. Major Young, he also had been associated with the Polish cause since January 1917. He became a lifelong supporter of the Polish cause. He wrote on Polish freedom and independence, and he too was decorated by the Polish government. Major Medill had a very challenging job with the overcrowding in Niagara-on-the-Lake. They had to set up another Polish army camp. This was in Saint-Jean, Quebec, and he took command of that and had to deal with the frigid winter there, and as well as other logistical issues. And then quickly, I just want to say that one of the instructors was Captain Alexander George Edward Smith. He was a Cayuga First Nations Canadian soldier. He'd been wounded in the Battle of the Somme. He'd been awarded the Military Cross, and he was the adjutant of one of the Polish training battalions. And then Captain Hubert Stefan, he was the provost marshal for the Polish Army camp. He later went on to serve with the Canadian Siberian Expeditionary Force. There were many others, but these are basically the pictures that I could collect. The experience in Niagara-on-the-Lake would have been as successful as it was without the support of local Canadians. The parish priest for Niagara-on-the-Lake, Father Hugh Joseph Sweeney, was instrumental in tending to the soldiers' religious needs before the chaplains arrived. He also loaned various sacred vessels from his church to the Polish chaplains when they did arrive, and he also arranged for a cemetery near the church as a final resting place for Polish soldiers who died during their training. Laura Turczynovich, she was a Canadian from St. Catharines. She was an opera singer. She married a Pole. She was in Poland at the time of the outbreak of the war. She saw firsthand the destruction. She returned to St. Catharines in the spring of 1917, and she was a big supporter of the Polish cause. She did speaking tours, and she also supported the training of nurses, and she visited the Polish camp in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Janet Karnakan was a leading citizen of Niagara. She was a local historian. She too wrote very nicely about the Polish experience at Niagara-on-the-Lake. Ross Beckett was the first YMCA chief of staff for the Polish camp. He was there for nearly a year. He did everything he could to make the experience of the Polish soldiers as comfortable as possible, whether it was religious services, reading and writing materials, sports, entertainment. Charles William Jeffreys. Now, that painting I showed you a couple of slides ago, he's the author of that painting, and he was actually commissioned by the Canadian War Records Office in 1918 and asked to record the history of the Polish camp. Quite a number of paintings of his are in the Canadian War Museum collection. Now, to my knowledge, none of them are on display, but that's another story. Then we have George Franklin Rand. So he was not a Canadian, really. He was an American. But I'm going to call him a Canadian because he owned a lot of land around Niagara. He had a big summer home there, and he invited Polish officers. He and his wife, they entertained them. So again, a very warm welcome. And then the last person is Elizabeth Caroline Asher. Not enough can be said about her. She was the correspondent for the St. Catharines Standard, and almost every day that the Polish army was in Niagara-on-the-Lake, she wrote something about them. She also was a huge force in organizing care for the army, especially during the outbreak of the Spanish flu. And she continued to write about Poland after the war, and tried to raise money for relief efforts there. And she also organized the pilgrimages to the cemetery in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and she helped tend to the graves. So for her efforts, the Polish government decorated her multiple times after the First World War. And all these mayors, St. Catharines and Niagara-on-the-Lake, all played a huge role in welcoming the Polish army, organizing welcoming ceremonies, farewell ceremonies, parades, all kinds of entertainment. And so Niagara-on-the-Lake was a pretty loyalist town. You know, this was kind of new for them to have all these non-Anglo people there. And after some initial suspicion, relations got pretty warm, and I think the leaders had a large part to do with that. Now, so who are the Poles that came to Niagara-on-the-Lake? Well, just for starters, you know, well over 22,000 recruits came. That's the big story. More than 20,000 went overseas. Ignacy Jan Paderewski, the famous Polish pianist, he had his own initiative to try to recruit a Polish army in the United States, but he became now a supporter of this initiative, and he visited the camp a couple of times, along with his wife. So she was a big player in forming something called the Polish White Cross, which raised funds in both Canada and the United States to care for wounded soldiers, recruit nurses, and so on. Colonel Zygmunt Iwanowski, so he was an interesting figure, another artist, so to speak. He was a celebrated portraitist and illustrator. He became friends with Paderewski. He initially joined on recruitment tours in the United States. He brought them to Niagara-on-the-Lake. He fell in love with the army in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and he joined the Polish army, and eventually also was commissioned as an officer and went overseas. Captain Wacław Gonczarowski. So he's kind of important. Remember, we talked about the French Foreign Legion at the beginning. So he was instrumental in trying to get a Polish component to the French Foreign Legion. Once it was decimated, he never gave up his dream of trying to have a Polish army in the West. So he was part of the Polish military mission that came to North America. He also visited the camp. And Lieutenant Stanisław August Poniatowski was a bit of a celebrity. He'd been part of the French army, badly wounded. He became part of the mission to North America, but his big claim to fame was he was the grandnephew of the last king of Poland, so he caused quite a sensation everywhere he went, and he would spend a lot of time at Niagara-on-the-Lake. And then finally, so now the army was launched. Now there was a question of, could Poles be allowed to transfer the Canadian Expeditionary Force to the Polish army? So, as you know, conscription was announced in Canada in 1917. People started to be called up in 1918. And now the question was, could any Polish Canadians who were conscripted be allowed to transfer to the Polish army? So this was a sensitive question, and it's not surprising that 3 military districts had to deal with this issue. The district dealing with Manitoba, which again 2/3 of the Polish Canadian population was. But also military district number 3, which was based in Kingston, but covered places like Vilno, Barry's Bay, Kashubit in Ontario, where again, significant Polish population. And then also military district number 4 in Montreal, which also had significant number of Poles. So domestically, Mr. Stanisław Sielski, he was part of the Falcons in Winnipeg. And he was the one who approached General Huntley Douglas Brodie Ketchen, who was the commander of the military district in Manitoba, to see if Polish Canadians could once conscripted, could transfer to the Polish army. I mean, the reason was we're all fighting the same cause, so if they want to transfer, let them transfer. Lieutenant Colonel William Gracie, too, was part of the whole discussion. And then I want to mention John Hilliard Leach, because he was a Winnipeg lawyer. He'd lost his son already in the First World War. He was a friend of Prime Minister Gordon's. He was really dead set against the idea of having Polish Canadians conscripted to the Canadian Army to be allowed to transfer to the Polish Army. And in the bottom row, Lieutenant Colonel Leo Vichy Laflèche, he was the commander of the Montreal district, who was having to deal with this issue, as was Brigadier General Thomas Hemming, who looked after military district number 3. And as I say, this whole discussion did reach the highest levels. At the end of the day, there were transfers between the Canadian Expeditionary Force to the Polish Army, both in Canada, as well as Poles who were in overseas, such as in the Forestry Corps or the Railway Corps, that wanted to see some action. They were allowed to transfer. And the discussion also happened internationally as well. So there were, in France, you had people like Jan Henrik de Rosen, who was a Polish painter living in Paris. He had been in the French army, he was now in the Polish army. He was lobbying for this, as was Roman Dmowski, who was the chairman of the Polish National Committee in Paris, and Józef Jaruzelski, who was part of the military department of the Polish Committee in Paris. We saw Jan Franciszek Smulski earlier. He's still in the United States, but he also was lobbying for this. And General Louis Archinard, may not be a Polish-sounding name, but he was actually the commander, the first commander of the Polish army in the First World War. And as we'll see, he lobbied for these transfers as well. And I threw in General Józef Haller, no evidence that he actually lobbied for any of this, but he would have been the beneficiary. So they were all lobbying their Canadian counterparts, so Canadians who were in London or Paris, and by this time Mewburn is the new Minister of Militia and Defense, as well as the Prime Minister. As I say, there were a number of transfers to allow. So overall, Canada had a big role in supporting the Polish Army in the First World War. So that's part one. And I'll try to, I know I'm running out of time, but we'll go through World War II pretty quickly. I'll have to obviously cut this short. So Canada, not fully independent, but at least was able to declare war on its own in 1939. Poland, this is how Poland looked in 1939, re-established at the end of the First World War. Canada unchanged. But after about 5 weeks of war, Poland was gone, partition between Germany and the Soviet Union. And now Canada and Poland worked together again in the Second World War. So as I mentioned before, Polish ships helped transfer thousands of Canadian troops to Europe. The Polish and Canadian navies worked together in the Battle of the Atlantic. It was not uncommon in battle reports to hear names like ship names like Restigouche and Pierun, Assiniboine and Błyskawica, Chilliwack and Bujak, all mentioned in the same report. Polish Navy was at the Battle of Dieppe. The Polish destroyer Ślązak gave support to the Canadian raiders, and the captain of the Ślązak, Captain Romuald Nałęcz-Tymiński, helped save the lives of 85 Canadians trapped on the beach. He was later awarded Britain's Distinguished Service Cross. And Poland was at D-Day with Canada as well, and in the shape of the cruiser named Dragon. Dragon was commanded by Commander Stanisław Dzienisiewicz. It was initially supporting the British Beach Sword, but by the evening of June the 6th, it was now supporting Juno Beach. And the Canadian-Polish navies also cooperated together off the coast of France to protect the landing beaches. In the air, Poles and Canadians fought together in the Battle of Britain. In fact, in the RAF number 11 group, you found the first number 1 RCA fighter squadron as well as the 303 Polish squadron. This pilot here, that's Canadian Flight Lieutenant John Alexander Kent. He actually commanded the Polish squadron, and then later on was commander of a Polish fighter wing. He was awarded Virtuti Militari by Poland during the war. Polish Air Force was also at Dieppe in the shape of 5 Polish fighter squadrons covering the landings. Even in Tunisia, there were Poles and Canadians fought together as part of the RAF's 244 wing in the Desert Air Force. Squadron leader Frederick Brad Foster was the commanding officer of Canadian 417 Squadron, and Stanisław Skalski, famous Polish fighter ace, led the Polish flying team. And Canadians also participated in special operations, supply missions to Poland, and we'll talk about a little bit, if I have time, the first international humanitarian mercy mission flown by the RCAF just after the war ended. And on land, I think most of you know the 1st Canadian Corps and the 2nd Polish Corps formed part of the British 8th Army. They supported each other through the various battles in Italy. In Normandy and in Falaise, the 1st Polish Armored Division was under the command of the Canadian Army, but there was forward observation officers from the 4e Régiment d'Artillerie Moyenne, a French-Canadian artillery unit, that was assigned to the Polish division. And this picture here shows a picture of Pierre Civiliups. Shows shows a picture of Pierre Sévigny, who was decorated by Poland before the end of the war. He was not the only Canadian officer being decorated at for the Battle of Falaise, as they called down artillery fire under intense fire of their own. At the Battle of Arnhem, Bridge Too Far, Lieutenant Russ Kennedy of Canadian Engineers played an instrumental role in saving 160 Polish soldiers from General Sosabowski's parachute brigade and getting them across the river. And through the campaign of Northwest Europe, General Maczek's 1st Armored Division was under command of General Guy Simmons of the 1st Canadian Army. Everybody recognize these two figures? So you got Mackenzie King and Canadian Prime Minister, and on the left-hand side is General Władysław Sikorski. He was the Polish Prime Minister. He came to Canada a number of times during the war. And Canada played a huge role in the safekeeping of Polish art treasures during the war, accepting Polish engineers and technicians who were refugees, setting up a Polish military mission in Canada that was meant to replicate the Niagara-on-the-Lake experience. Didn't work out that way, though. There were about 600 Canadians and 100 Poles in ferry command that were ferrying planes made in the United States to bring them to Europe. This was hard and dangerous work. In the photo you see Flight Lieutenant Kazimierz Buzinski. I single him out because he had a terrible crash. His plane crashed in downtown Montreal. They were on their way to India. And it crashed in a downtown neighborhood, and there were 10 Canadian civilians on the ground who were killed. Buzinski and his crew are buried in Montreal's Notre-Dame-des-Neiges cemetery. Poles also joined the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, and of course they were assigned to stations right across Canada. So many Polish or Canadian towns got to host Polish pilot candidates. And then there was a little known experience, which I only learned about recently, that there was actually a Polish women's platoon formed in Canada as well, and it trained in Kitchener, Ontario. So the Polish art treasures came to Canada. At the top we have the two custodians who brought the treasures. Wiktor Podolski was the Polish Consul General. He worked to try to find safe places for these treasures. Dr. Wacław Gabiński succeeded Podolski later in the war. He was very concerned that with the political situation developing in the war, that the Polish treasures might end up in communist hands, and so he took some initiatives to actually hide the treasures. And then there were two Ottawa women, Maria Kozłowska and Franciszka Śliwka, who did unbelievable work by hand to repair some of the tapestries when they were here in Ottawa. And some of the Canadians who were key to this, it was Vincent Massey, who made the arrangements for the Polish treasures to come to Canada. Dr. McCurry, he was the head of the National Art Gallery. He was approached, he was sympathetic, he didn't have any space in the art gallery. Dr. Gustave Lanto was the National Director of the Archives of Canada. He just had a brand new building built. It's right across from the Civic Hospital. It was a special archives building. He agreed to keep the Polish treasures there. And then later on, when the decision was taken to actually hide the treasures more carefully, Major Walter Ross Creighton, many of you might recognize the building, it used to be the Bank of Montreal. It's up near Wellington and Sparks. Today it's the John A. MacDonald building. He hid some of the most valuable treasures there in his vault. And then the convent of the Sisters of Daughters of Precious Blood off an Echo Drive, they also hid some of the treasures. In Quebec, Dr. Tadeusz Brzezinski, he made touch with many organizations in Quebec to see if they could find hiding places. He's the father, actually, of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who became President Carter's National Security Advisor. Dr. Tadeusz Poznanski, whose grandson would end up giving the talk here today, he made, thank you, he ended up making contact with Cardinal Villeneuve in Quebec City to look for an appropriate hiding place, and he ended up hiding the treasures, a good portion of them, also in Saint-Anne-de-Beaupré, where the Superior General was Father Léon Laplante. So my grandfather
worked with both those individuals and went with Polkowski and Zaleski to hide the treasure there. This is the Polish military mission. This was the attempt to kind of recreate the Niagara on the Lake experience. Those in the center are two of the last recruits to the Polish army that's being formed in Canada in World War II. The man on the left is my uncle. Sorry if this is starting to sound a little genealogical, but you can see why I'm passionate about this. And on the right is a special sleeve patch that the North American volunteers wore on their uniforms. I don't know why the Canadian flag is represented by a blue ensign, but that's what it was. Now, these are the number of Poles that were working with Canadians to see if they could get a recruitment mission again in North America. I don't have time to go through all the details, but the main thing is that there was a lot of effort done, there was a lot of back and forth to get this organized. Again, at the highest level, these were the Canadians who were negotiating with the Poles. The main point seemed to be really around funding, who was going to pay for this whole initiative, and it wasn't until Poland came up with an answer that basically it had would get some money to fund this, that the mission would go ahead. And then the mission was set up in Windsor, Ontario, again close to the Canadian border. Canadians gave many of their facilities rent-free to the Polish army, and these are some of the buildings that were used. Unlike Niagara on the Lake, there was a substantial Polish population in Windsor, and they welcomed the Polish army in Windsor. So there was a Polish church, which became the Garrison Church, and there was a couple of Polish facilities where the Polish army would meet for social occasions and so on. And Owen Sound was also where these new recruits would do their training. So these are the Canadians that played a huge role. So Richard Vincent Malloy, he was a manager of the Dominion Transport Company in Owen Sound. He was also part of the Board of Trade. He did a lot of negotiation to get the facilities for the Polish army. Father William Hudson Murray was the pastor of the Catholic Church in Owen Sound, and his church became the Garrison Church for the Polish army. And George Marin and Wilfred Garfield Case were the mayors who opened and closed the Polish mission there. And in Owen Sound, there were only about 14,000 people, and only 53 in the area claimed Polish ethnicity. So the arrival of the Polish forces was something really different for them. And then again, Owen Sound, like Windsor, offered a number of buildings to put at the disposal of the Polish army. Unfortunately, the mission was not successful, and that's a whole other discussion, but they only got about 1,000 or so recruits from North America. A number of things worked against the mission, such as the American eventual declaration of war in December 1941, as well as the creation of a whole new Polish corps in the Middle East. So the North American recruits weren't as necessary, and to be honest with you, they weren't that interested either, given some of the experiences their parents had been through, or their fathers had been through the First World War. Now, this is really breaking news, but there was a women's platoon that was formed in Canada in 1944, this after the closure of the Windsor mission. So 29 women, Polish women, trained in Canada and Kitchener. 9 of them were North American Poles, but the real story is the 20 of them who were refugees from the Soviet Union that made their way out of the Soviet Union, went to Iran, went to India, went to Mexico, and had an opportunity to join the Polish army. They did, and they trained in Kitchener, Ontario. Lieutenant Colonel Mary Julia Dover, I think the highest ranking woman in the Canadian Women's Army Corps, was the commander of the Kitchener camp, and Second Lieutenant Maria Zofia Piniska was the commander of the Polish platoon. I show her here in the Navy uniform. She switched to the Navy later on in the war, but of the 2 pictures I have of her, this one was the more becoming one. Canadians also flew supply missions to Poland, secret supply missions. And the real trick here, and point one on the score, is that the 2 RAF squadrons that flew to Poland, 138 Squadron, 148 Squadron, were RAF. So no Canadian squadrons flew to Poland. But what I want to assure you here is there were Canadians among the crew, and they're often forgotten. And so they were among the crews, and these flights were very dangerous. So through 1943, they were flying over a northern route. They had to go over Denmark, the Baltic Sea, over Germany. Of course, Germany was tightening up its air defense systems by this time in reaction to Allied bombing. And there were many Canadian losses. So I won't go through each of them, but these were losses that typically happened either on the way to or back from Poland. They were dropping, as I say, supplies and radios, sometimes secret agents, to help the Polish underground. In this particular crash, the two airmen fell into the Baltic Sea. Their bodies were never recovered, but they are recorded in the Runnymede Memorial for all the lost airmen. And if you look at the graves, you can see that none of them are in Poland, or very few, as we'll see, because, again, they were killed either on the way or back from Poland. The secret missions continued into 1944, except now, instead of being flown from England over this dangerous northern route, they're being flown from Italy. But it's pretty dangerous, too, because they have to fly over Hungary and Yugoslavia and over Polish mountains. So here we go, Serbia, Hungary. And then there were some that actually did make it to Poland. This Beamland's flight here was actually meant to go to the Warsaw Uprising. It had already started by now. So this was, as you may know, the huge Polish resistance uprising in Warsaw. It started on the 1st of August. The idea was now, could these supply missions from Italy help the Warsaw Uprising? And in the early days, there was a lot of confusion. And although this plane was supposed to go to Warsaw, it was diverted elsewhere, but shot down nonetheless. As was this plane. And as you can see, these crew members, they crashed in Poland and are buried there. Now, I just want to spend a moment on this plane. The airlift to Warsaw, the Allied airlift to Warsaw during the uprising was really desperate and urgent. And it was clear that 148 Squadron, which was based in Italy, couldn't be doing this by itself, so they had to bring in other squadrons. And one of them was bomber squadrons, 178 Bomber Squadron RAF. And Flying Officer McCrae flew from 178 Bomber Squadron, flew a supply mission. He made it to Warsaw. He crashed and was killed in Warsaw. And then these are other supply missions to Poland. Even though the Warsaw Uprising was still going on in September, it was pretty much over, but missions were now being flown to help supply other resistance groups elsewhere in Poland. Now, the war is over, and there's something called Operation Poland. And this was basically an initiative. There was a charitable committee called the United Polish Relief Fund of Canada. It saw the terrible state that Poland was in and wanted to do something to help. So Canada, completely geographically unaffected the war. Poland, the end of the war, has now been moved to the east. Basically, Poland lost all its eastern territories after the Second World War. Some of the lands had been annexed by the Soviet Union when it was allied with Germany. The Soviet Union kept those lands. Poland was compensated with a few lands to the west. What you don't see on the map is the destruction that existed in Poland in 1945, nor do you see now, I'll tell you, it's the imposition of Soviet domination in Poland. So, as I say, Poland was in a desperate state. The infrastructure was gone, and they were really short of medicines. Warsaw was obliterated. Poland needed help. And Lawrence Burpee, who was the Canadian president of this United Polish Relief Fund, he wanted to do something. He wanted to get penicillin to Poland. He'd been a passionate supporter of Poland for a long time. He'd done many things in his career, one of which was the founding editor of the Canadian Geographic Journal. He wrote a very friendly article about Poland at the beginning of the war, and Poland was obviously part of his heart. But how could you get the penicillin to Poland? That was the big question. So he approached his friend, Senator Thomas Wien, who's been over 40 years in the House of Commons, had lots of contacts as a sitting senator. He then approached Colin Gibson, who was the Minister of National Defense for Air, and said, can you get the penicillin to Poland? Can you get the RSDF to do that? Gibson agreed. But the big problem now was landing rights in Poland, because the Soviets controlled all the airfields. Plus, you couldn't get a flight directly from Canada to Poland in those days. One of the places was have to stop would be England, and another place would be Germany. And wherever they have to stop in Germany was also in the Soviet zone. So Hume Wrong did a lot of work, negotiating work to get Canadian landing rights in Eastern Germany and in Poland. So, as I mentioned, alluded to, these flights came from Canada. They originated right here in Ottawa at Rockcliffe Air Base. They flew to England in B-17s and Liberators from the 168 Heavy Transport Group. And then in England, they flew to Germany. And then from Germany, it was Berlin. And then from Berlin, they would go to Warsaw. So, unfortunately, there was a crash. So, of the flights that went to Poland, one of the planes did crash in Germany, and the entire, sadly, entire crew was killed. So 5 flights were made in total between the fall of 1945 and January 1946. And of the 5 tons of penicillin were delivered to Poland in a very desperate time. But sadly, of the 5 flights, one of them ended in the loss of the entire Canadian crew. So how do we remember all of this? Well, in Niagara-on-the-Lake, fortunately, there is a commemoration every year. There's a pilgrimage to the little Polish Army cemetery in Niagara-on-the-Lake. It's been going on since 1919. It's the 100th anniversary of the pilgrimage. I think 41 soldiers died in Niagara-on-the-Lake while training there. 25 of them were buried, stay to this day in Niagara-on-the-Lake. The other bodies were returned to their families in the United States. At the University of Toronto, in the Hart House, there is a plaque that commemorates the University of Toronto's role in training the cadre of Polish officers. In Warsaw, there is, in 1998, a monument was erected to the Polish-American volunteers who went to France during the First World War. Unfortunately, there's no acknowledgement that over 20,000 of these soldiers were trained in Canada, but nevertheless, I know that, so I think that's an important monument. And then over the last couple of years, this was a fabulous exposition. Unfortunately, it was only temporary. It's in the Niagara-on-the-Lake Historical Museum. I took a picture of every single artifact and label I could there. Fabulous exposition of all the artifacts related to the Polish Army's stay in Niagara-on-the-Lake. In World War II, well, it's interesting. The very first monument to Canadian-Polish relations is sort of like the last event of World War II. So this is the plaque on a military hospital on Nowowiejska Street in Warsaw that commemorates the loss of those Canadian airmen who were delivering penicillin. Now you'll note that the plaque is only in the Polish language. Unfortunately, there were no Canadian officials. I mean, there were some representatives of the United Polish Relief Fund, but there were no Canadian government officials at this commemoration because Canada had no diplomatic mission in Poland yet. And Lawrence Burpee, whose idea this was to bring the penicillin, he was supposed to be at this commemoration, but unfortunately he died on the way. He died in England, so he didn't make it to the commemoration. The following year, the exact same plaque, only in the English language, was erected in the Catholic chapel at the Rockcliffe Air Base.
Where is that now?
We're coming to that in just a moment.
Databases.
We're coming to that in just a moment. So in 1964, Lester B. Pearson helped unveil a monument to Canadian airmen lost over Poland. There's some inaccuracies with that monument. We can talk about that at another time. This is the crash site of Flying Officer McCrae, who crashed in Warsaw. And in any case, he's RCAF. In Poland, many of you may know this is the famous Warsaw Uprising exhibit, or monument rather. So there is a plaque, it's on a wall behind the monument where it acknowledges the Allied air units that supplied the Warsaw Uprising. So it mentions 148 Squadron, 178 Squadron. What it doesn't mention is that although RAF, there were Canadians in these squadrons, as well as Australians and New Zealanders. In 1995, that RCAF monument here in Ottawa to commemorate the Canadians lost over Poland was rededicated. The airmen were awarded posthumously the Polish Home Army Cross, and the monument itself was adorned with the Polish Home Army Cross. Oops. There we go. In 1999, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien made the first official visit by Canadian Prime Minister to Poland. There, in front of the Canadian Embassy, he unveiled with Prime Minister Jerzy Buzek 2 stones, one from Poland, one from Canada, to commemorate Polish-Canadian cooperation during the Second World War. In 2001, the Polish treasures that had been hidden in Quebec City returned to Quebec City, this time not hiding, but for people to view, so it was a special exhibit. And in Warsaw, in Wawel Castle, there is a plaque, this is the image on the right, that acknowledges that the Polish national treasures were stored in Canada for safekeeping during the Second World War. There was a whole controversy that happened after the war, but that's, again, another subject. In 2005, the Polish military mission in Windsor was commemorated on the Dom Polski building. It's about the only surviving building from that era. And I think this answers the question. The plaque that was in Rockcliffe was rededicated in 2007. It's now at the chapel at Uplands, and it was Ambassador Piotr Odrodziński who initiated that. In Owen Sound, pretty much all the buildings are gone, but somebody did discover back in 2002, they were out in the hike, they discovered a tree that had Polish language carved into it from a Polish soldier who had been training in Owen Sound, and the tree has been designated as a Bruce Trail Heritage Tree in 2011. It became a Heritage Tree, Ontario Heritage Tree in 2017. And then most recently, the Polish Consul General in Toronto, Krzysztof Jelak, came to Owen Sound last November and unveiled a plaque with the Owen Sound mayor to commemorate the stay of the Polish army in Owen Sound. So, I know I went over time, very sorry about that. I think saying thank you, Canada, is really what I want to say from my heart. I am a Canadian, despite my name. I was born and raised here in Canada. I can't help but thank Canada enough. If it wasn't for Canada's generosity, I wouldn't be here. Between 1946 and 1947, about 5,300 demobilized Polish soldiers emigrated to Canada. And between 1946 and 1952, Canada admitted over 50,000 Polish displaced persons from Europe, and that's how my father and my grandmother were able to end up joining my grandfather here. So I think that taken together, the events that made up the Canadian-Polish relationship through 2 world wars is impressive. If they are dispersed, as they often are, then they get forgotten and are barely footnotes in history. And I do hope, based on what you've seen today, that you'll agree with me that this story of this relationship is worth telling and worth preserving. I believe it's fascinating. And the Canadian War Museum is a truly amazing national treasure. And I know there's many hard choices to make when it comes to what information to display. But that said, from my last tour, I think any mention of the Canadian-Polish relationship through the 2 world wars seems completely absent here. And I just hope that one day, some aspects of this story will find a home here so they can be told to all visitors. And it just adds another chapter, another diversity chapter in the story of Canada's relationships.